The Silent Viscount. Chapter 1. The House of Unspoken Things. The house at Blackwood Rise sat atop a gentle hill like a man holding his breath. Its grey stone walls absorbed the weak afternoon sunlight rather than reflecting it, and the ivy that crept across the eastern face had been allowed to grow unchecked for so many seasons that it had begun to nuzzle at the window panes like a persistent suitor. The gravel drive, recently raked, bore the fresh marks of carriage wheels, and from the open front door, open despite the chill of an October afternoon, a shaft of warm light spilled onto the steps. Inside that light stood Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, her hands clasped at her waist in a posture of anxious expectation. Beside her, bouncing on the balls of her feet with an energy that seemed to mock the very atmosphere of the house, stood a young woman of perhaps 22, peering down the drive with undisguised curiosity. "You'll wear out the flagstones, Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Holloway murmured, though there was no reproof in her voice. Indeed, there was something almost like relief in the way she watched the girl's restless movements, as if Miss Whitmore's very restlessness were a kind of warmth the old house had long been denied. Miss Emmeline Whitmore, Lena to those who knew her, though she had not yet been at Blackwood Rise long enough for anyone here to earn that privilege, turned from the doorway with a smile that crinkled the corners of her hazel eyes. "I cannot help it. I have been cooped up in that carriage for 3 days, and now to be so near London again, why, I feel as though I might simply fly there on my own wings." 3 days from Derbyshire is a long journey indeed, Mrs. Holloway agreed. "Will you take tea while you wait for your trunk to be brought up?" Lena hesitated. The house behind her, what little she had seen of it, was cavernous and shadowed, full of furniture draped in holland covers and paintings shrouded in dust sheets like ghosts at a masquerade. The front hall alone could have swallowed her family's entire cottage twice over, and the staircase that curved upward into gloom seemed less an invitation than a warning. She had been hired, after all, not as a guest, but as an employee, a music teacher for the young Lady Philippa Ashworth, sister to the Viscount St. James. "Perhaps I should wait until Lady Philippa is free," she said, her voice inadvertently dropping to a more proper pitch. "I would not wish to presume." Mrs. Holloway's expression flickered with something Lena could not quite read. Sympathy, perhaps, or a warning she was too kind to voice directly. "Her ladyship is aware of your arrival, Miss Whitmore. She asked to be informed the moment you were settled, and the Viscount—" She stopped, and the pause that followed was heavy enough to be felt. "The Viscount is indisposed. You will not be expected to present yourself to him." Lena nodded, accepting this as she had accepted the position itself, with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The advertisement she had answered had been brief to the point of obscurity. Music instructor sought for young lady of quality, comfortable accommodations, generous remuneration. Apply in writing to Blackwood Rise, Hertfordshire. There had been no mention of a viscount, no hint that the household she was entering was one presided over by a title. When the letter of acceptance had arrived, sealed with a crest she could not decipher, she had spent a full evening in anxious deliberation, wondering whether she, the daughter of a village clergyman, possessed the social graces required for such a post. But the remuneration was generous indeed, and her father's health had been failing for 2 winters now, and there were younger siblings to consider. So she had packed her meagre belongings, kissed her mother's tear-wet cheek, and set out into a future she could not possibly have imagined. The tea, when it came, was served in a small morning room off the main hall, a room that had clearly been recently aired and dusted, though the chill of disuse still clung to its corners. Lena sat on the edge of a chair that was far too fine for her simple grey travelling dress, and tried not to stare at the portrait that hung above the fireplace. It showed a young man, perhaps 20 years of age, with dark hair and eyes the colour of a winter sea. He was handsome in a severe way, his mouth unsmiling, his posture rigid with the kind of self-possession that spoke of old money and older expectations. The artist had captured something in his gaze, a watchfulness, a distance that made Lena feel, absurdly, as though she were the one being studied. "That is the Viscount," Mrs. Holloway said quietly, following her gaze. "Painted 5 years ago, just before he went away." Away. To the peninsula. The housekeeper's voice was carefully neutral. He served with distinction. There was talk of a commendation, I believe. But when he came home... She stopped, and the same heavy pause filled the room again. When he came home, he was changed. Lena waited, but Mrs. Holloway offered nothing more, and she knew better than to press. Servants' loyalties, she had learned from her mother, ran deep and silent as roots. Whatever the Viscount's story, it would not be hers to know. Not yet, perhaps not ever. She was here to teach music to his sister, nothing more. The door opened before she could frame a suitable response, and a girl burst into the room with the force of a small hurricane. She was perhaps 12 or 13, with a tumble of dark curls and eyes that were, Lena realized with a start, the exact winter-sea grey of the portrait above the fireplace. She was also, quite clearly, in a state of barely contained excitement. "You're here!" the girl exclaimed, skidding to a halt just short of sending the tea tray flying. "You're really here! I had begun to think Mama had changed her mind, or that you had changed yours, or that something dreadful had happened on the road. Bandits, perhaps, or a broken axle, and here you are, quite safe, and we can begin at once." Lena rose, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "You must be Lady Philippa." "Philippa, please. Or Pippa, if you like. Everyone calls me Pippa except Mama, and that is only when she is cross, which is not often, though she has been rather more cross than usual lately. What with—" She stopped abruptly, the words cut off as though by a pair of scissors. Her gaze flickered toward the portrait, then away. "Well, never mind that. Are you truly from Derbyshire?" "I have never been to Derbyshire. Is it very mountainous? I have read that it is quite dramatic, with peaks and valleys and such." "It has its moments," Lena said, amused. "Though I am afraid my corner of it is rather tame. My father's parish is in a valley, with hills all round, but they are more the sort you can walk up without needing ropes and pickaxes." Pippa considered this gravely. "That sounds pleasant. I should like to walk up a hill someday. James says—" Again she stopped, and this time the silence that followed was different. Thicker, sadder, weighted with something Lena could not name. "My brother," she added quietly. "He says all sorts of things. Or he used to." Lena looked at the girl more carefully. Beneath the whirlwind of energy, beneath the endless stream of words, there was something else. A watchfulness, a carefulness that seemed out of place in one so young. She thought of the portrait, of the unsmiling young man with the winter-sea eyes, and felt the first stirrings of something she could not quite identify. Curiosity, perhaps, or pity. "Shall we begin, then?" she asked gently. "I am told there is a music room. Would you like to show me?" Pippa's face lit up like a candle. "Oh, yes. It is this way, though I must warn you it has not been used in ages, not since—" She was off again, already halfway to the door, and Lena followed, leaving the morning room and its watchful portrait behind. The music room was at the end of a long corridor on the ground floor, its windows looking out over a garden that had clearly been beautiful once, but was now overgrown and neglected. Inside, the room was cavernous and cold, dominated by a pianoforte that stood in the centre like an altar. Dust sheets covered the chairs, the music stands, the instrument itself, and Lena's heart sank a little at the sight. "No one has played since James left," Pippa said, and her voice was smaller now, less certain. "He used to play, you know, every evening. He was very good. Our mother used to say that the house itself listened when he played." Lena crossed to the pianoforte and lifted the dust sheet, revealing keys that were yellowed but not, she noted with relief, warped. She pressed a single note, and the sound that emerged was thin and out of tune, but recognizably a note, recognizable as music. The house, she thought, had not quite forgotten. "We shall have to have it tuned," she said, "but that can be arranged. In the meantime, we can begin with theory if you like. Have you studied before?" Pippa shook her head. "Mamma wanted me to learn, but there was never time before, and then after." She stopped, and this time the pause was so long that Lena turned from the pianoforte to look at her. The girl was standing very still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the garden beyond the window. In the grey afternoon light, she looked suddenly older, suddenly weary in a way that had nothing to do with her years. "After my brother came home," she said quietly, "no one wanted music anymore." Lena did not know what to say to that. She did not know this family, did not know this house, did not know the story that hung in the air around them like smoke from a fire that had not quite gone out. She knew only that she had been hired to teach music, and that the girl before her seemed to need something more than scales and exercises. "Well," she said, and her voice sounded absurdly cheerful in the gloom, "we shall simply have to bring it back. Music, I mean. It has a way of finding its way home, if you let it." Pippa looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, the winter sea eyes held something that might have been hope. That evening, Lena dined alone in her room, as Mrs. Holloway had gently suggested she might prefer after her long journey. The food was excellent: clear soup, roasted chicken, a delicate apple tart, but she ate mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Through the walls of her room, which was in the family wing though at some distance from the main chambers, she could hear the sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of servants' voices, the wind rattling the windows in their frames. And beneath it all, another sound, or rather, the absence of sound. The house at Blackwood Rise was not silent, no house of its size ever truly was, but there was a quality to its silences that Lena could not quite name. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something that refused to come. As though the music that had once filled its corridors had left behind an echo that no one could quite forget. She thought of the portrait in the morning room, of the unsmiling young man with his watchful eyes. She thought of Pippa's bright chatter, so clearly a shield against something. She thought of the pianoforte, waiting in its cold room for hands that no longer came. And she thought, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the autumn chill, of the one sound she had not heard since her arrival, the sound of a voice. Any voice. The Viscount, whoever he was, wherever he was in this great house, had made no sound at all. She fell asleep to the wind's lullaby and dreamed of music that would not play. Chapter 2. The Sound of Silence. The pianoforte was tuned on Thursday. Lena had expected to wait at least a week. Tuners were busy creatures, she knew, and Blackwood Rise was not the sort of house that could command instant attention simply by virtue of its name. But Mrs. Holloway had sent a message to the village on Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon a stooped elderly man, with gentle hands and a perpetually surprised expression, had arrived with his tools and his tuning fork and his air of quiet competence. "Not been touched in 5 years," he muttered, running his fingers along the keys with something like reverence. 5 years. Shame that. Fine instrument. German make. Brought over special for the old Viscount, that was, the present one's father. He had an ear for music, they say, passed it on to the boy. Lena, who had lingered in the doorway under the pretense of arranging sheet music, tried to look as though she were not listening with every fibre of her being. "The present Viscount plays." Played. The old tuner shot her a glance that was sharper than his mild expression suggested. Before he went away, before the war. He bent to his work again, and his voice, when it came, was muffled. Different man now, they say, different entirely. Lena thought of the portrait, of the unsmiling young man with his watchful eyes. She thought of Pippa, of the way her chatter died whenever her brother's name was mentioned. She thought of the silence that filled the house like water filling a well. "What happened?" she asked, and then immediately wished she had not. It was not her place to ask, not her business to know. She was a music teacher, nothing more. But the tuner, if he heard the question, did not answer. He was absorbed in his work, tapping keys, listening with an intensity that shut out everything else. Lena took the hint and retreated to the morning room, where Pippa was waiting with a stack of theory books and a determination to learn that bordered on the ferocious. They worked through the afternoon, Lena teaching and Pippa absorbing, and by the time the light began to fade, the girl could identify every note on the staff and had begun to understand the difference between major and minor keys. She had, Lena realized with surprise, a natural aptitude, a quickness of ear and a sensitivity to tone that could not be taught. "You have a gift," she said, not for the first time. "If you apply yourself, you could be quite accomplished." Pippa beamed, then sobered. Do you think James would like to hear me play? Once I am good enough, I mean." Lena hesitated. She did not know the Viscount, did not know what he would or would not like. But Pippa's face held such hope, such desperate longing, that she could not bring herself to dash it. "I think," she said carefully, "that anyone would be glad to hear music played with such feeling. Whether your brother is ready to hear it, that is another matter. Some wounds take longer to heal than others." Pippa nodded, accepting this with a wisdom beyond her years. "He does not speak," she said quietly. "Not to anyone, not since he came home. He walks in the gardens at night when he thinks no one is watching, and he sits in the library for hours just staring at the fire. But he does not speak. He does not seem to hear when anyone speaks to him. Mama cries about it, but only when she thinks I cannot see. And the servants whisper. They think he has gone mad, or that the war broke something in him that cannot be fixed." Lena listened, her heart aching for this child who carried such a weight. "What do you think?" she asked. Pippa was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said finally, "that he is still in there, somewhere. I think he is just hiding, and I think if we could find the right thing, the right sound, he might come out again." The tuned pianoforte waited in its cold room, and Lena, watching the girl's face, made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would help Pippa find that sound. The first time Lena saw the Viscount, she did not know it was him. It was 3 days after the tuning, and she was walking in the gardens, such as they were, in search of roses for the music room. Mrs. Holloway had mentioned that the old rose garden, though neglected, still produced a few blooms late into autumn, and Lena had thought that a bit of colour might make the room feel less like a tomb. She was bent over a particularly stubborn bush, wrestling with a thorny stem, when she became aware that she was being watched. The sensation prickled along her spine, raising goosebumps despite the mild afternoon sun, and she straightened slowly, turning to face whoever was there. He stood at the edge of the garden, half hidden in the shadow of a yew hedge. Tall and dark, dressed entirely in black, he might have been a figure from one of the Gothic novels her mother so enjoyed. His face was thin, almost gaunt, with hollows beneath his cheekbones that spoke of sleepless nights and uneaten meals. And his eyes, those winter sea eyes she had seen in the portrait, were fixed on her with an intensity that stopped her breath. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind stirred the dead leaves at their feet, and somewhere in the distance a bird called, and Lena stood frozen, her hand still reaching for a rose she had forgotten she wanted. Then, without a word, without a sound, the Viscount turned and walked away. He moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, and within seconds he had vanished into the shadow of the yew hedge, leaving Lena alone with her thorns and her racing heart. She did not mention the encounter to anyone. But that night, lying awake in her bed, she found herself listening, really listening, to the silence of the house. And beneath that silence, faint but unmistakable, she heard it, the soft creak of a floorboard in the corridor outside her door. The almost imperceptible whisper of breath. The sound of someone standing very still, very close, listening as she listened. She held her breath, waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy as velvet. And then, just as she was beginning to think she had imagined it, there came another sound, so soft she might have missed it if she had not been listening with every fibre of her being. A sigh. Not a sigh of frustration or impatience, but something else entirely. Something that sounded, impossibly, like longing. And then the floorboards creaked again, and the footsteps retreated, and Lena was alone with the wind and the dark and the echo of a sound she could not explain. The next morning, she went to the music room early and played. Not the simple exercises she had been practicing with Pippa, but something else, something older, deeper, more personal. A lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, its melody simple and sweet, its harmonies uncomplicated by the demands of technique. She played it through once, twice, 3 times, her fingers finding the notes without conscious thought, her mind elsewhere entirely. And when she finished, when the last note faded into the cold morning air, she sat very still and listened. The house listened with her. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the wind, just the creak of old timbers, just the distant sound of servants beginning their day. And then, a floorboard creaked in the corridor outside. Soft, careful, deliberate. Lena did not turn, did not move, did not even breathe. The creak came again, closer this time. And then silence. And then, so faint she might have imagined it, the sound of breathing on the other side of the door. She played again, another lullaby, this one even simpler, even sweeter. And when she finished, she sat in the silence and waited. The breathing continued for a long moment, and then, without a sound, without a warning, it was gone. But Lena smiled, because she knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason, that she had been heard. Chapter 3. The Language of Music. October bled into November, and November brought rain, endless, drumming rain that turned the gardens to mud and kept Lena and Pippa indoors for days on end. They spent those days in the music room, working through exercises and etudes and the beginnings of real repertoire, and in the evenings Lena sat by the fire in her room and listened to the house around her. She heard many things in those long autumn nights: the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind in the chimneys, the distant murmur of servants in the kitchens below, and always, always, the soft, careful sounds of the man who walked the corridors after dark, who stood outside doors and listened, who seemed to be searching for something he could not name. She never saw him again, not directly. But she felt his presence everywhere, in the careful arrangement of books in the library, in the single fresh flower that appeared on her windowsill each morning. Roses at first, and then, when the roses died, hothouse camellias from the conservatory, in the way the servants moved more quietly when they passed the closed door of his rooms. And she heard him too, not in words, never in words, but in other ways. In the soft thud of a book replaced on a shelf, in the whisper of papers in the library, in the single note one night that rang out from the direction of the music room long after she had gone to bed, a note so pure, so achingly beautiful that she lay awake until dawn, waiting for another that never came. Pippa noticed nothing, or if she did, she said nothing. She was too absorbed in her music, too eager to learn, too determined to become good enough to earn her brother's attention. And Lena, watching her practice day after day, felt her heart break a little at the hope that shone in those winter-sea eyes. "He walked past the door yesterday," Pippa said one afternoon, her fingers never stopping their scales. "While I was playing, I saw his shadow under the door." Lena's hands stilled on the sheet music she was arranging. "Did he?" "He stopped, for just a moment, and then he walked away." Pippa's voice was carefully neutral, but Lena could hear the tremor beneath it. "Do you think he heard me?" "I think," Lena said slowly, "that he heard something. Whether he was ready to listen, that is another matter." Pippa nodded, accepting this with the same quiet wisdom she brought to everything. "I will keep playing," she said. "One day, he will stay." The first snowfall came in early December, dusting the gardens with white and transforming Blackwood Rise into something almost beautiful. Lena woke to a world transformed, the grey stone softened by snow, the bare trees traced with silver, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt something like hope. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, intending to cut some of the evergreen boughs that grew near the kitchen garden. Mrs. Holloway had mentioned that the house was always decorated for Christmas, and Lena, who loved the season with an almost childlike fervour, was eager to help. But when she reached the garden door, she stopped. He was there, the Viscount, standing in the snow at the edge of the terrace, his dark coat stark against the white, his face lifted to the grey sky. He was not moving, not speaking, not doing anything at all, just standing, as still as the trees around him, as though he had been there for hours and might stand there for hours more. Lena watched him for a long moment, her breath clouding in the cold air. And then, before she could think better of it, she pushed open the door and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath, but she did not turn back. She walked toward him slowly, carefully, her footsteps crunching in the snow, and when she was close enough to see the frost on his eyelashes, she stopped. "My lord," she said quietly. He did not move, did not acknowledge her presence in any way. His eyes remained fixed on the sky, his face expressionless, and Lena had the sudden, vertiginous sense that she was speaking to a statue, not a man. But she had come this far, and she would not turn back now. "I am Emmeline Whitmore," she said, "your sister's music teacher. I do not know if you are aware of me. I imagine you are aware of everything that happens in this house, even if you pretend otherwise." She paused, gathering her courage. "Pippa is very talented. She has a gift for music, a real gift, and she plays for you, every day, hoping you will hear." Still nothing. The Viscount's face might have been carved from the same stone as his house. "She loves you," Lena continued, her voice softening. "She misses the brother she used to know. And I think you miss him too. The man you used to be. The man who played the pianoforte every evening, who filled this house with music." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The wind blew, stirring the snow at their feet. A bird called in the distance, and Lena stood in the cold, speaking to a man who would not, could not, hear her. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in his face. Not much, just the faintest softening around his eyes, the slightest relaxation of his jaw. He did not look at her, did not speak, did not move. But something changed, something she could not name, and Lena knew with the same certainty that had guided her through the long autumn nights, that he had heard her. She turned and walked back to the house, leaving him alone with the snow and the silence. But as she reached the door, she heard it. A single sound, so soft she might have missed it if she had not been listening. Footsteps, following her. She did not turn, did not stop, but she smiled. That evening, she played for him. She did not plan it, did not even realize she was doing it until her fingers found the keys and the music began to flow. It was not one of the pieces she had been practicing with Pippa, not a lullaby or an etude or anything she had ever played before. It was something new, something that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. A melody that wound and turned and reached towards something just out of sight. She played for a long time, the music growing and changing, finding its own shape. And when she finally stopped, when the last note faded into the silence, she sat very still and listened. The house was quiet. The wind had died. Even the fire in the grate seemed to hold its breath. And then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the door, she heard it. A single word, spoken in a voice rough with disuse, cracked with emotion, barely more than a whisper. Again. Lena's heart stopped, then started again faster than before. She did not turn, did not speak. But her fingers found the keys, and she played the melody again. The same melody, the same reaching, yearning music. And this time, when it ended, she heard something else. The soft sound of a man crying. The next morning there were 2 camellias on her windowsill instead of 1. Chapter 4. The Sound of Listening. Christmas came to Blackwood Rise like a hesitant guest, peeking through the doors before daring to enter fully. Mrs. Holloway and the servants decorated the hall with evergreens and holly, and a great Yule log was laid in the fireplace of the drawing-room, and Pippa practiced her Christmas carols with a fervour that bordered on obsession. But the real transformation was not in the decorations or the food or even the music. The real transformation was in the house itself. It was subtle at first, so subtle that Lena might have imagined it if she had not been watching so carefully. A door left open that had always been closed, a book left on a table in the music room, its pages marked with a ribbon. A single word, again, whispered in the darkness, repeated night after night until it became a kind of ritual. And then, on Christmas Eve, everything changed. They had gathered in the drawing-room after dinner, Lena, Pippa, and Lady Ashworth, the Viscount's mother, a faded woman with the same winter sea eyes and a sorrow that clung to her like perfume. They had sung carols, opened small gifts, drunk wassail from silver cups, and through it all, Lena had felt his presence like a warmth at her back, though she had not seen him, had not heard him, had not known for certain that he was there. But when Pippa sat down at the pianoforte to play her Christmas gift, a simple arrangement of Silent Night that she had been practicing for weeks, Lena saw the door open, saw the figure that slipped through it like a shadow, saw the Viscount take his place in the darkest corner of the room, his face half hidden, his eyes fixed on his sister's hands. Pippa played. And for the first time in 5 years, James Ashworth, Viscount St. James, listened. The music was simple, so simple that Lena, with her trained ear, could hear every imperfection, every slight hesitation, every note that might have been better played. But it was also beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with technical skill. It was beautiful because it was love, pure and simple and unadorned, offered without expectation, given without demand. When Pippa finished, the silence that followed was different from any silence Lena had ever known. It was not empty. It was full of hope, full of fear, full of the terrible, wonderful possibility that something might finally change. And then the Viscount moved. He crossed the room slowly, carefully, as though walking through water. He stopped beside the pianoforte, looking down at his sister with an expression that Lena could not read. And then, in a voice that cracked and wavered and sounded like the most beautiful music she had ever heard, he spoke. Pippa. That was all, just her name. But it was enough. Pippa launched herself from the piano bench and into her brother's arms, and Lady Ashworth began to cry, and the servants, who had gathered in the doorway to watch, began to applaud. And Lena, standing alone by the fire, felt tears streaming down her own cheeks and did not care who saw. The Viscount looked up. Across the room, across the distance that separated them, his winter-sea eyes met hers, and in them, for the first time, she saw something other than distance. She saw gratitude, she saw wonder, she saw, impossibly, the beginning of something she did not dare to name. After the celebrations died down, after Lady Ashworth had retired with a headache and Pippa had been sent to bed still glowing with happiness, Lena found herself alone in the music room. She had come to tidy the sheet music, to bank the fire, to perform the small rituals that ended each day. But when she pushed open the door, she found that someone had been there before her. The fire was burning high. A single camellia lay on the piano bench, and standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden, was the Viscount. He did not turn when she entered, did not speak. But she knew with the same certainty that had guided her through all the long autumn nights, that he was waiting for her. She crossed the room slowly, giving him time to flee if he wished. But he did not flee. He stood as still as he had stood in the snow that first morning, his face half turned from her, his breath misting the cold window-pane. When she reached his side, she did not speak. She simply stood with him, looking out at the garden, at the snow, at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the winter sky. They stood like that for a long time, minutes, hours. Lena did not know. She knew only that the silence between them was different now. Not a wall, but a bridge. Not an absence, but a presence. Finally, so softly she almost missed it, he spoke. "I heard you." His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "I know," she said. "In the garden, that first morning. I heard you." He paused, and she saw his throat work as he struggled to find words. "I have heard everything, every note, every word, every—" He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice was even softer. "Every laugh." Lena's heart stopped. Her laugh. The one sound he could not silence. "I could not—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I tried. To block it out. To block everything out. The world was too loud, too much, too—" He pressed a hand to his chest, as though the words themselves caused him physical pain. "But your laugh, it slipped through, every time. It found me." Lena did not know what to say, did not know how to respond to such an admission, such a gift. So she did the only thing she could think of. She laughed. It was not a loud laugh, not the full-throated sound he had described. It was soft, almost shy, a tentative offering in the face of his vulnerability. But it was real, and it was hers, and she gave it to him freely. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "Stay," he said, and it was not a command, not the demand of a lord to a servant. It was a plea, raw and desperate and hopeful as a child's prayer. "Stay and play, stay and laugh, stay and—" He could not finish, but he did not need to. Lena reached out and took his hand. It was cold, trembling slightly, but it held hers with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I have music to teach, a garden to tend, She hesitated, then smiled. A silence to fill. His hand tightened on hers, and for the first time since she had known him, James Ashworth, Viscount St. James, smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, tentative, uncertain, as though he had forgotten how. But it was real. It was his. And it was the most beautiful music Lena had ever seen. In the weeks that followed, the house at Blackwood Rise began to change in earnest. The Viscount appeared at meals, silent at first, then speaking in brief sentences, then, gradually, joining in the conversations that swirled around him. He walked in the gardens with Pippa, pointing out the first signs of spring. He sat in the music room while Lena taught, not speaking, not moving, but present in a way he had not been before. And one evening, when Lena had finished playing and the fire had burned low and the house had settled into its nightly silence, he crossed to the pianoforte and sat down. His fingers found the keys with the ease of long practice, and then, slowly, hesitantly, he began to play. It was the melody she had played that first night, the melody that had called to him, that had slipped through his walls and found him in the darkness. But it was different now, fuller, richer, woven through with harmonies that spoke of healing, of hope, of a future he had not dared to imagine. Lena listened, and as she listened, she wept. When he finished, he turned to look at her, and in his winter-sea eyes, she saw everything he could not say. "Thank you," he whispered. She crossed to him and took his face in her hands. "You are welcome," she said. And then, because it was true, because it had always been true, she added, "I love you." He closed his eyes, and for a moment she feared she had pushed too far, asked too much. But then he opened them again, and they were bright with tears and wonder and something she had never hoped to see. "I love you too," he said, and his voice, rough and broken and beautiful, was the sweetest music she had ever heard. Outside, the snow began to melt, and somewhere in the darkness a bird began to sing. The silent Viscount had found his voice at last. Epilogue. Spring. The gardens at Blackwood Rise were blooming. Roses climbed the trellises in a riot of colour. The yew hedges had been trimmed into neat, orderly shapes, and in the centre of it all, on a bench that had been placed there just that spring, a man and a woman sat watching a girl run through the grass. "She is faster than last year," James observed, his voice still soft, still careful, but no longer hesitant. "She will outrun us all soon." Lena laughed. That laugh, the one he had never been able to silence, the one that had called to him across the abyss of his own making. "She has been outrunning us for years. We are simply too slow to notice." He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes now, lighting them from within. "We are not too slow," he said. "We are exactly where we need to be." Pippa reached them in a whirlwind of motion and collapsed onto the grass at their feet. "I am going to be the fastest person in all of England," she announced. "Faster than horses, faster than carriages, faster than—" "Music?" Lena suggested, her eyes dancing. Pippa considered this. Music is different. Music does not need to be fast. Music just needs to be heard. James looked at his sister, at the woman beside him, at the garden that had bloomed from the ashes of his silence. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something he had thought lost forever. Peace. "Play for me," he said softly. "Both of you. Play for me." And in the garden beneath the spring sun they did. The music rose and swelled and filled the air, and the house at Blackwood Rise, the house of unspoken things, of silences too long kept, listened at last, and was healed, the end. As this story draws to its final breath, I want to thank you, truly, for walking every step of this journey, for lingering in its silences, for feeling its heartache, and for believing, even in its darkest moments, that love might yet prevail. If this tale has stirred something deep within you, if it has reminded you of the quiet power of devotion, resilience, and hope, then I invite you to stay. Subscribe and step with us into many more worlds where love is tested, hearts are broken, and, always, something beautiful endures. Your next story is already waiting.